Question number 3, Honourable Annette King.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. In light of his comments that a taxpayer bailout is his, quote, least preferred, end quote, option, how much is he prepared to spend to save the SkyCity deal?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I'd like to simply point the member to the answer given by my colleague, the Minister for Economic Development, yesterday to an exceedingly similar question. I have been clear all the way through that our least preferred option is to provide any funding to SkyCity for the Convention Centre. We are in the process of discussions, and I'm not prepared to conduct those discussions in the public domain, as that would undermine our position.
Supplementary question,
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette
Well, in light
King.
of that answer, when he said in the House on the 12th of November 2013 that for, quote, a little, if any, investment by taxpayers, New Zealanders would get an international standard convention centre, how big did he envisage the little investment was going to be? And did that also include an international standard that was not an eyesore?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, yes to the latter part of the question, and in terms of the first part, I refer the member to the primary answer to the primary question. But the clear position of the government, of the Minister for Economic Development, Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister is that actually putting funding as our least preferred option is to provide any funding to SkyCity. However, there have of course been other positions this week, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, when asked if the government should contribute funds to the Convention Centre, one response was, you could probably say, you know, for the overall benefit, yes. And speaking of little, that was one Andrew Little on News Talk ZB.
Oh, supplementary.
Supplementary question. Order.
Well, in light of his,
Order. Supplementary question, Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, can he assure the New Zealand public that any decisions around potentially giving millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to SkyCity will not have been affected by the tens of thousands of dollars SkyCity has donated to the National Party, such as the $60,000 donation recorded in 2005?
Well, insofar as there may be some ministerial responsibility, Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I'm not sure of the ministerial responsibility, but I think the answer would be yes anyway.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable
In light of his
Annette
comments
King.
yesterday, when did he advise all other ministers that a taxpayer bailout of SkyCity would require a cut to their budgets to stump up for cash for a business that made $66.6 million profit in the last 6 months?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I think the member is actually mischaracterising the Minister's comments yesterday, but nevertheless, it is clear that it is the government's preference that our least preferred option is to provide any funding to SkyCity. No proposal has been received from the Minister of Economic Development to the Minister of Finance, at least that I'm aware of, and I think I may be aware of it if it had occurred. And in the meantime, we'll just see how it goes.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Annette King.
Don't sound so weary, Mr. Speaker. This is a really good point of order.
Order. I will look. I'm looking forward to that. Order. Order. Order.
Well, point of order. Second point of order, Mr. Speaker. That was a point of order.
Order. We'll deal with the first point of order first, which I'm looking forward to with anticipation and excitement.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I've taken your advice in terms of very tight questions, and my question asked when the Minister of Finance advised all ministers that there would need to be a taxpayer bailout if they were required to provide money to SkyCity, and the Minister didn't answer that.
He did. He disputed that he'd had those discussions with the ministers, as I understood the answer. My question, in my opinion, he definitely addressed that question. Does the member have a further supplementary?
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker.
Then the member better ask it.
Will he guarantee today that he will not support further gambling concessions to SkyCity to save the deal?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, the government has confirmed that there won't be further concessions and any further law changes.
It's a yes.
Supplementary question. Order. Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
How many HIP operations could be undertaken and how many state houses could be built for $128 million that SkyCity is demanding from the taxpayers? And wouldn't it be of more benefit to New Zealanders to invest in them rather than a multinational company that's making huge profits?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, the member presumes way too much in her statement and is highly hypothetical. But if she's concerned about that, I'd talk to her own leader, who actually was on the radio this week saying funds should be contributed to SkyCity.
Authenticate
Order.
that.
Supplementary
question.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King. Order. Order. The interjection level coming from both sides is now unacceptable. Would the member please ask her supplementary question?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the Prime Minister won't listen to him, the Minister of Finance, will he listen to the 22,000 New Zealanders who in just the past one day have signed Labour's petition opposing a taxpayer bailout of the SkyCity deal?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I need to point out to the member that the government's position is entirely consistent. The Prime Minister has made it clear that it is his least preferred option to provide any funding to SkyCity. I, as Finance Minister, have made it clear that our least preferred option is to provide any funding to SkyCity. The Minister of Economic Development has been saying since December last year that our least preferred option is to provide any funding to SkyCity. I appreciate that on close examination those three statements may sound very different, but I've done some analysis in my office by placing them side by side and they are in fact the same.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Is he prepared to match the contribution to the SkyCity bailout raised yesterday from the public, who showed that what they thought of the government's idea by donating $41.20, 2 bottles of water and a lime fruit burst lolly?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance, I would point out that as we've been clear all the way through, negotiations are continuing. Our least preferred option is to provide any funding to SkyCity. It is fair to say that the member's leader is well ahead of her in that he signalled the other day he'd be prepared to give more than the amount of information that that the member has just raised, the amount of money that the member's raised. Yes, he does.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker,
Point of order, the Honourable Annette King.
I don't think the member heard my question or understood it, and I'm very happy to repeat it.
No, I'm sure he did hear it. Would the Minister give a guarantee that he'd match the public contribution? He clearly said not prepared to give that guarantee because they're still in the stage of negotiation. Order. I have a point of order from the Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table a transcript of Andrew Little with Larry Williams on ZB when he said exactly those things.
Order. Transcripts are freely available to members if they want to get them. Question number 5.
Mr Speaker.
Number 4, Denise Roach.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the